All right, I'm going to get us going with some housekeeping announcements. I'm MJ. I am Collab CMO, and I'm going to run through a couple of points here at the top, and then I will hand it off to our speaker, Taylor. Today what we have for you is a breakdown of a very interesting data set where we went out and we surveyed 250 engineering leaders to quantify the impact of different design review methods on new product development. So Taylor is going to take you through some of the most interesting data from that report, some of our key takeaways, having gone through and analyzed this data. And what you're seeing today is a subset of an even larger data set that we're going to be making available as like a written report, probably coming out next week. So what you'll get as a registrant to this event is a link right afterwards, both to the recording of this webinar, in case you want to share that with other people in your company, and also a link to download the full data set and the full report if you want to dig a little bit deeper. So those two things will be coming to you right after this event. Also, we're going to take some Q&A at the end. So if anything is interesting to you, or you have a piece of feedback or a comment or a question on any of the data you see today, you can put that in one of two places. You can open up the Zoom chat and you can put it there, or there's also a dedicated Q&A box, and I'll be kind of checking out both of those things as we go through, and I will queue up all of those questions for Taylor at the end. So look out for the email after the event, and if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat or the Q&A, and with that, I will hand it over to Taylor.
Cool. Thank you, MJ. Excited to see a great turnout today. I think, we've spent like weeks and months even putting together this data, running this survey, and in turn building the report. And I think, we were excited about it and had a hypothesis that other people would be really keen on it and excited to see it. So glad to see so many people here kind of eager to get a preview of kind of like the most interesting points or kind of the biggest takeaways from this data. So thanks everybody for joining. So I'm Taylor. I think, looking at the attendees list, there's some folks here that I've met, but a ton that I haven't. So I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Collab. I also work really, really closely with our customers. For those of you who don't know Collab, we are a software company. We exist really to solve this sort of many industry global problem that is engineering teams generally struggle with collaborating with one another. And where does that happen kind of frequently throughout the product lifecycle is design review, whether that's a formal technical discussion around like a gate, let's say, or it's having someone look over your shoulder, hey, am I on the right track? Am I directionally correct with this? That's really kind of those intersection points where engineering teams collaborate with each other, with supply chain teams, with manufacturing, whatever else. And so that's really why we were so keenly interested on the topic of this report, which is, what is the impact of design review methods on new product development? Basically, every manufacturing team we talk to over the past couple of years is trying to either compress product development timelines or reduce cost. Many of them are trying to do both at the same time. And also, most manufacturing teams we talk to are struggling with design review in one way or another. So we wanted to conduct this survey to get some, objective third-party data to understand, what might the connection be between those two things. I think on top of this quantitative survey, we also have a lot of sort of qualitative, anecdotal information and a lot of experience working in the manufacturing space. So we work with dozens of Fortune 500 companies on, specifically how do we improve design review, lots of them across heavy machinery, industrial equipment, automotive, and the like. So a couple notes on what we're going to cover over the next little bit. So we've got an hour here. We might not use all of it, but we've got lots of time for Q&A should we need it. We're going to start by just taking you through exactly how we ran this survey. So just a couple quick points on the method and the demographics so you know who this information came from. The second thing we'll dig into, the fun part, the key findings, a breakdown of the data. What did this survey actually tell us? Then we'll move into the actionable takeaways. So what we've seen as opportunities to improve design review or kind of respond to this data. And then we'll spend lots of time on questions. So a couple notes on the survey method. So MJ mentioned we surveyed 250 people. These people were sourced via 4 independent professional survey panels. All that means is that they were, we put a lot of effort into making sure we were asking the right people. And there was a rigorous process for the actual method of questions and that sort of thing. So meaning we want to talk to the right people and we wanted to make sure that we were getting good, high quality data. So we worked with folks with some real kind of domain expertise on survey design to make sure that this was good information that we were collecting. So a couple notes on demographics, a spread of industry, but all in the manufacturing space. So automotive, consumer hardware, heavy machinery, industrial equipment. That's where the folks came from. Primarily VPs or head of job titles, though everybody was manager and up. So we wanted to make sure that the folks we were asking these questions to had accountability towards product development, milestones, and launches. We wanted to make sure they had visibility on those things. So manager and up, but primarily VP. Primarily, these folks that we surveyed were at companies in that 1,000 to 5,000 headcount range, but everybody had at least 1,000 people, and then we did have 35% in that 5,000 and above. And everyone we spoke to, everyone we surveyed was using PDM or PLM. This was really important because most of the organizations that we work with, they're using PDM or PLM in some capacity. And we wanted to make sure that that was the group that we were pulling this information from so that we didn't have, all kinds of information about data management and that sort of thing. We really wanted to make sure folks at least had that kind of baseline in place before we started digging deeper. Lots of folks using Team Center, Windchill, Innovia, 3DX, and of course, SolidWorks PDM. So here's the kind of high level findings, the really interesting stuff. First one, this is maybe no surprise, but we'll get into the specifics. Late stage design errors are a significant driver of delayed product launches. So when something isn't getting out the door, often late stage design changes are to blame, and we'll go through all the detail around that. The second point, design review quality was rated as the number one most important factor for impacting an engineering team's ability to deliver on time. So not design review speed, not requirements like tracking and management, but design review quality. So most of these leaders felt that that was the number one most important thing. And then interestingly, across all this data, we really were able to kind of bubble up 3 key gaps that seem to exist almost universally as it relates to engineering teams' ability to do effective design review. Everyone really seemed to kind of struggle with 3 things, or folks in particular, we could see these as the 3 top things that separate like the great product development teams from the ones who are struggling a little bit. Okay, so the first finding, late stage design errors are delaying product launches for 90% of companies. That is a big number. If we look at the percentage, what percentage of launches, we see that teams say somewhere between 1 and 20% of launches are getting delayed due to those changes. And 1 to 10%, for example, as being the biggest field here, that could seem like a low number. But when you think about the health of these companies, if the number was much higher, these companies probably wouldn't have a long life ahead of them in terms of product development. So we see that as actually quite a high number as it relates to the health of the organization. Even a handful, even 5% is a lot for an organization. But then we see that milestone number gets a lot higher in terms of getting affected by late stage design errors. So the milestones being kind of the incremental elements along the way in the larger launch. So what this tells us and what we hear kind of in industry is that for most organizations, their launches, especially if you have like a tier 1 working with an OEM or something like that, those launch dates can't move. And what that means when the milestones get delayed is that something else has to give around that launch. Other sacrifices are being made. In many cases, those sacrifices are, the hours that need to be worked, the kind of last minute hustle around a deliverable, which obviously can be very difficult on teams, lead to burnout, all those sorts of things. But then also we see, what sacrifices are made in terms of something that gets shipped with a known issue. That might become a safety critical problem. That might become a warranty problem, a cost problem. So, the kind of main takeaway here being that late stage design errors are affecting launches for 90% of companies. Only 10% of companies, respondents really said that none of their launches were affected by this. So needless to say, this is a universal problem across manufacturing. So the next key takeaway, better design reviews lead to fewer errors. So 8 out of 10 respondents believe that by improving design reviews, their team could catch at least 40% of the late stage errors. So at least 40% of the things that are coming up as late stage changes, for a big group here, it was actually in the 60% plus or even 80% plus, that they could have been prevented had better design review been done. So what that's telling us is that these late stage errors are not major non-preventable, technical problems or something like that. They're often miscommunications. The right person wasn't in the room when we brought that up. They're, people working with other people problems. And 40% of them didn't need to happen, at least. But, we're seeing here in this data, more than 23% felt that over 80% of those things could have been prevented. So a lot of these things just don't need to occur as a result of, better design review. So similarly, design review quality, this was the takeaway we said earlier, design review quality was rated as the #1 predictor of overall PD velocity. This is really interesting. So we see some of the other options, requirements tracking, when we look at what's the most important predictor of the ability to deliver on time. Requirements tracking, so defined as the ability to track and respond to shifting requirements. I think everybody deals with this in some capacity. That was #2. Design review speed, so how quickly we could actually go through that exercise, was #3. And then you see things like resource management, project management, product data management fall to the bottom. So design review quality being a really, really critical indicator so that you don't hit those misses, mistakes, those things that when caught later become very time consuming and expensive. Okay, so we mentioned that across this data, really 3 key themes came up, 3 key gaps as it relates to how we could actually improve design review. So as a quick recap, the data so far has told us that late stage design errors are delaying product launches for 90% of companies. And then at least 40%, but in some cases more like 80% of these errors could have been prevented with higher quality design review. So that obviously begs the question, how do we make design review higher quality? So when we looked at the data, there were really 3 key things that stood out. The first thing, more engagement from subject matter experts. So we'll get into this is some really interesting findings in front of us, but what we're hearing kind of anecdotally as we've been talking about this data with folks in the industry is that subject matter experts, more and more over the past 5 to 10 years, are really globally distributed, which makes sense, right? Like there's a acquisition of a battery company maybe, and the expert in that is sitting in a different country than where some of the other design work is done. Those folks are critical to catching issues, but they can be very difficult to engage because of geography or language barrier or whatever else it might be. So when we look at what this means for the immediate engineering team, then we go a step outside that into cross-functional teams. So this might be manufacturing, this might be purchasing, something like that. Suppliers, so external, and then customers. We see how that changes in terms of how teams are able to engage these folks in design review. So right at the top here, 56% of teams report that most or all of their engineers provide useful feedback during reviews. So it's an okay number. I'm sure most teams would like that to be higher, but still it's the majority. Then as we drop into cross-functional teams, it goes down. So only 45% of teams report that cross-functional reviewers are providing useful feedback most of the time. It drops further when we go out into suppliers. And the really staggering one here is that only 6% of teams get design feedback from most of their customers. So we often hear big problems as it relates to requirements tracking and that sort of thing. Customers aren't giving us clear enough requirements, whatever. But then we're seeing only 6% of teams are actually proactively engaging customers in design review itself. So this is a clear and kind of immediate gap as it relates to design review quality, is how do we get better engagement from subject matter experts? This is an interesting one from Kevin Walters, who is the Senior Director of Hardware Engineering at Mainspring. Mainspring is a really high growth technology company. And so an interesting finding they found, and kind of they work with us with Colab, is their ability to get supplier feedback on 3D CAD. So basically what they started doing was, by being able to share 3D with suppliers, they can get that feedback early before they've done first cut of drawings. So they're getting that early proactive feedback on what works, what isn't working, maybe smarter ways to manufacture something, less expensive ways to do it, so that they can get what Kevin calls directionally set. So by not waiting until drawings are ready, by getting that proactive early feedback, they can catch things when they're really easy, fast, and expensive changes, and not have to wait until maybe something's been tooled or things have gone further down the line. So here's the second kind of gap that existed across the board: keeping track of feedback. So what we're finding is that design issues are just slipping through the cracks. So even when they're brought up in the meeting, in the design review meeting, let's say, the quality is coming down because no one's doing anything with that information. What is maybe the most staggering kind of takeaway or stat from this entire report is what's on the screen here. On average, engineering teams lose track of over 40% of all feedback generated during design reviews. I think for folks that spend hours and hours, late night and early morning, all around the world engaged in design reviews, this is a disheartening number. But yeah, about 43% of the things that are brought up just disappear. So we see, for about 30% of teams, it's 20 to 40%, and for about 25% of teams, it's 40 to 60% of feedback. I think, we've heard anecdotally among customers and that sort of thing, oftentimes when something hits production, when an issue comes back, there's some thought of, I swear someone mentioned that. Or worse, you're the person that did mention it and no one wrote it down. So this is a really kind of a staggering number that we need to think about. So why is feedback getting lost? There's really two kind of root causes, or two key themes that we've seen. The first one is that documenting feedback is very difficult. So let's say you're looking at a complex 3D model with thousands of parts in it. There we go. Actually documenting these often nuanced design ideas can be really difficult. They can go beyond just like a cell in an Excel spreadsheet. So often what it means is someone spends hours building a PowerPoint deck, trying to communicate design intent, communicate this more nuanced idea. It just becomes really difficult to write these things down. We have a note here. Best case is one of these, extensive time-consuming PowerPoint decks. The worst case is a sticky note, and we have seen that. The second is no centralized place for feedback tracking. So again, a spreadsheet that is really divorced from like the 3D data. So you lose context. Worst case, very confusing email chain, often with internal and external parties, where the kind of key point gets lost. So similarly to the point from Kevin, this is one from Greg, someone who's been a kind of a long time collaborator of ours, I'd say, at Kraken Robotics. Really what he talked about was the value in trying to build a sort of one-stop shop as it relates to design review. And really what he's talking about here is the ability to see, you want to be able to see the context, like whether that's 3D model, a drawing, a spec sheet, whatever it is that you're reviewing, You want to see all that feedback in the same place as the content you're reviewing, but then also have the ability to manage the actions of that feedback. And the better we can do to kind of bring those things together, the less likely it is that something is going to slip through the cracks. So this is another kind of, this is maybe the most surprising or the most kind of complex idea that came out of this report. And this is this idea of staying realistic about the role of PLM as it relates to collaboration and design review. So on the left-hand side here, we asked respondents, what is the best way to prevent miscommunication? The number one finding was better tools to document design feedback. You can see lower down here on the list is more training on PLM, expanding access to PLM, that sort of thing. Then on the right, when we say within your PD processes, which of the following functions do you use for PLM? And by and large, 56% of respondents do not use PLM at all during NPD. So what this tells us is that there are clearly issues here, challenges here that are really not, from the perception of the respondents, not solvable by PLM. So we see that better processes for managing product data was the second most popular method for reducing miscommunication, which makes sense. These Zoom reactions, there they are. You can't get through a meeting without triggering some sort of Zoom reaction. But the least popular choices were more training on PLM or expanding access to PLM. So we see huge kind of initiative around better processes for managing product data, but we're not seeing PLM as the best option for doing that. So what that leads us to believe is that engineering leaders are worried about product data issues outside of PLM. So here's another kind of interesting one from Simon Robinson, who's the chief engineer at Ford Pro. And really what this talks about is just the complexity around managing product data, especially as it relates to working externally. So he says, it sounds really simple. You start out with the latest CAD, you design to it, and you're good. But what is the latest CAD? And when you're working, let's talk about an automotive program with dozens and dozens of suppliers all kind of contributing to CAD, it's really, really complicated to understand what is the latest. Then you get out of sync, you're not sure what's released, who's allowed to see what, and it can become extremely complicated to make sure that everybody's working on the same thing. So that's really kind of the key findings from the report. So in summary, late stage design errors are a huge problem as it relates to product launches, with them delaying launches for over 90% of companies. Design review quality is a critical component in catching those late stage design errors. And then we see that folks seem to struggle across the board with engaging subject matter experts, tracking feedback, and then sort of that nuance between documenting feedback, data management, and the role of PLM. So anytime we get into this data, I think, and talk about how we do a lot of work on design review, and design review is important, naturally folks just want to see a couple things and want to understand what it is we actually do. So I'll show you really quickly what that is, and then we can get into some questions. So here is kind of some of the work we do, some of the ways that we solve this idea of better engaging subject matter experts. So I talked about this a little bit, but one of the key challenges that we see with engaging subject matter experts is that these are often very busy people because they are leveraged all across the business. They are often distributed globally, which means time zones and all that, all that fun stuff. And it can be really difficult to get them in a room, maybe with 10 other people, and try and talk about these very complex design ideas. And so what Collab allows you to do is asynchronously engage these stakeholders. So that doesn't mean that you're not going to at some point do a live session if you need to, but what it does mean is you can greatly reduce your reliance on those meetings and often make those meetings higher value. So you don't have a subject matter expert showing up to a 2-hour-long design review meeting looking at a 1,000 component model for the first time. The idea being that we can engage them in these asynchronous sort of reviews very easily, and they can do it on their own pace when they're really ready to respond to that information. We talked about how documenting feedback in context was really critical to design review quality and making sure that things didn't slip through the cracks. You can see here, someone has come in and linked a piece of feedback to the geometry of a particular component in this 3D model. They're able to do 3D markups, engage other people, add comments, that sort of thing. This immediately adds a layer of context that is completely lost when you put a piece of feedback in a spreadsheet, for example. Everything is automatically tracked, so it doesn't have to be somebody's job to take notes in the meeting, put it in a list, send out action items, that sort of thing. It is just automatically tracked by doing the review. And obviously all of this and more is kind of available in detail in that, either in the report or you can get a copy of the presentation. So we'll move to some questions now, pull up the Q&A. MJ, did you want to start going through the queue and kind of see where we want to start in terms of questions?
Yep, sure. And anybody who has a question, you're welcome to drop it in the Q&A as we get into this first round of questions as well. So Taylor, first of all, one question is around to what extent do you think errors and launches are getting delayed by what this person describes as just design gaffes, right? Like a true mistake versus kind of requirements shifting when you're not expecting them to, or after the point where that's not necessarily ideal. And how do you think that shows up both in your work with customers as well as in this particular data set?
Yeah, I think like if we look at the data, there's a note here, I forget the number off the top of my head, but basically that the majority of feedback that's coming up was deemed to have been preventable with higher quality design review. And I think what that tells us is that most of these things are these like silly preventable miscommunications or mistakes. We're never going to have perfect requirements. Requirements are never going to stay the same throughout an entire development cycle. That's just not realistic, and maybe they shouldn't, right? As you learn more, change the requirements, tighten the scope. I think we're seeing that by and large, most of these things are preventable miscommunications. An example that I heard years ago, but I've seen in other forms several times, is an example of an automotive tier one that produced a whole bunch of parts wrong because they were doing a review with another supplier via email. At some point in that email, the bullet point changed in terms of what the bolt pattern was. Somebody grabbed that one change, like the mistake when it kind of changed in the thread, manufactured it the wrong way, and everything had to be redone. I think that is often what we are seeing, not some sort of major requirement shift that nobody noticed.
Absolutely. I have one person here asking, they joined halfway through, so they're wondering if you can just reiterate the demographics of the people that were surveyed.
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we just go back to that so you can see it? So apologize for all the flashing slides. So here's the demographics. So a spread across automotive, consumer hardware, heavy machinery, industrial equipment. Everyone we surveyed was manager level or above, but primarily VP. Everyone was 1,000 person plus in terms of headcount. Most people in the 1,000 to 5,000 range. And then a really important point is that everyone we surveyed is using PDM or PLM. So we wanted to make sure that while everyone's using different ones, everyone at least had something in place as it relates to data management and PLM.
Awesome. Yes, and this person in particular was kind of curious about, if we were surveying people that are small and medium-sized companies, either they may not have a PLM or they might not quite know how to use it or haven't, fully embraced the rollout of it yet. So yeah, we were trying to screen for people that are certainly using PLM rigorously in some areas of their business. We found it to be very surprising, as Taylor noted, that people are not using it as heavily in NPD. Sure, anecdotally, we've heard from customers that they change the design so often and so quickly during NPD that they've decided to take that process out of the context of PLM. But to see that it's a kind of a widespread phenomenon to the point where over half of teams actually are doing the same thing and taking that data outside of PLM And it may be leading to some of these challenges with product data within the NPD process. That was surprising to us. And actually, if anybody on this call has other thoughts that might explain that pattern, that's one of the things that we've been asking people about since we got this data set back.
Yeah, I think one thing we've heard around that, this idea of not using PLM for NPD, is this idea that, like in prototyping, for example, it happens too quickly, and the process in PLM can be quite complex on purpose, and as a result, quite rigid, and it can't quite keep up with the kind of with the pace and the nature of new product development.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to go back to a question that we received specifically when you were talking about the fact that 43% of issues identified during design reviews are not documented or tracked, and so therefore they're not really making it into the end product. And this person asked, have you identified the methodology used when we are, observing these design review failures? In particular, the design verification stage involves mechanical safety and compliance topics, so it wouldn't be useful to try using some kind of speedy tool or speedy methodology to elicit all of the insights. So I think kind of I'll make a couple of comments here, and then Taylor, curious to hear your thoughts as well. We did not have any survey question about the specific process people were using to run their meetings, for example. But one piece of data that we didn't actually put on the screen during this presentation, but that you can find in that wider report, is we asked about what tools teams are using to document their design feedback and track it. And by far the most popular tool is going to be spreadsheets. I think that was over 60, perhaps 65, 66% of teams are using spreadsheets to document their design review feedback. So you end up with these large issue tracking spreadsheets. And there's a couple of challenges, I think, that may be leading to the phenomenon that we're observing of 43% of the design feedback just slipping through the cracks. So one is spreadsheets are predominantly text-based, and trying to convey design intent and what really an issue means can be quite challenging when the medium you're using is completely text-based. It requires often someone to type out a very long explanation of what they mean. And so, with the mounting kind of expectations on engineers day to day, they just don't have time to type out these really detailed explanations. And so what you end up with is kind of a confusing and out of context summary of an issue that ends up in the spreadsheet that requires someone to kind of go do some detective work to figure out what they actually need to do to respond to that feedback. So that might be one reason why a lot of the feedback doesn't get actioned or doesn't get tracked. And then some of the other popular answers for how are you documenting design feedback were like free CAD viewers. And so free CAD viewers obviously don't have that problem with the context, because the free CAD viewer, if you can mark things up, will allow you to provide the context of the 3D model and avoid some of that admin work of the detailed documentation of feedback via text. However, some of the challenges we see around that is the need to check in and check out files in order to make comments responding to other people's comments. And so it kind of forces this process of documenting and responding to reviews to be in sequence as opposed to in parallel, which can be frustrating and kind of slow things down. And also it creates oftentimes a huge amount of artifacts in PLM. So like if every issue has to be documented in a markup tool and then attached to the record in PLM, if you're using it for a new product development project, you might have, or even like a value analysis workshop, you might have hundreds of these artifacts then attached to the part in PLM. And somebody would then have to kind of go back and sift through all of these annotations to identify and really track things through to action. So ultimately, we believe there's kind of a best of both worlds scenario where you can document things in context, but also by doing the review and marking up the part like you can in Colab, things get kind of automatically tracked and organized into spreadsheet format in the background for you. So you can kind of get all the benefits of the context of a CAD viewer and all the benefits of the high-level overview of a spreadsheet without someone having to go through the admin headache of populating both things. So that is less of an explanation of like the approach to the design review itself. And what we see as kind of the driving force behind all of that feedback slipping through the cracks is actually the approach to the documentation and the tracking of feedback afterwards.
Yeah, I would say like in the like many years now of talking to hundreds of teams about how they do design review, there's we rarely encounter an overly intentional approach to design review beyond how a spreadsheet or PowerPoint deck gets prepared. It's primarily Teams meetings and then somebody documenting via PowerPoint and spreadsheet.
Somebody says amazing presentation. Thank you. We appreciate you. Somebody is wondering whether Colab, I believe this is a question about Colab, do you store artifacts of design review in PLM?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. I think there isn't one way that folks want a tool like Colab to integrate with their PLM. Everyone uses PLM in a slightly different way. I would say there's different ways we do this depending on the PLM kind of implementation. Right now, the primary things that we communicate with the PLM is the fact that the file exists in a review in Colab, the stage of the review, so whether it's completed and been reviewed in Colab or whether it's currently under review, and if there is and how many kind of unresolved feedback items exist on that file. That's not to say that's the extent of what we can do or the extent of what we will do, but at this point, those are kind of the universal things that everybody wants in terms of the bidirectional sync between Colab and PLM.
Awesome. General comment and not a question. Design reviews not included in the PLM cycle is not surprising, though counterproductive. This may be mainly due to resource limitations and the aforementioned last-minute changes in design review content. Colab seems to have something that may work to resolve this. Taylor, any commentary on that feedback?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with the point that this can be counterproductive in that you then have things kind of existing in different places. The note on this may be due to resource constraints is an interesting one. There's probably some truth to that. I think also maybe the root cause of that problem is that it requires too much effort to do it via PLM, given what PLM was built to do. Like PLM is I'm generalizing, but largely speaking, like a really good system of record. It is a really good method of, I think the word artifacts was used, like creating those sort of released official records and that sort of thing, and storing them, managing them, and all kinds of other things throughout the life cycle. It's not really built to be that collaboration engine. And so I think it may be due to resource limitations, but the answer might not be to add more resources to it. Like that might be not the right path. And I definitely think the last minute changes in design review content, or even just the pace of product development. It's fast, it's iterative, it's fluid, and PLM is much more intentionally rigid to make it good at what it does. So I think that conflict exists, and it's an interesting one. I think it's definitely something, this concept of not using PLM for NPD is something that we want to understand a little bit more. So would love kind of any thoughts or feedback about that topic.
When I posed the question to the audience before about how might you explain this data, one of the pieces of feedback that we got was maybe it's a mindset change that's needed. To what extent do you think some of these patterns of not using PLM can be solved by a mindset change versus like perhaps advancements in technology that complement PLM?
I think the mindset shift that's needed, that is happening, is this idea. I think there was this well-intentioned idea of single source of truth that's important, but I think the kind of negative consequence of that is the idea that, and part of this is from on-prem and that kind of technology, is the idea that you need to do everything in the one tool. And what we believe Colab as a SaaS technology and as a cloud tool is that it's actually much better to use the right tool for the job and leverage great integration so that it feels like you're using one tool. It feels like one kind of fluid system. I don't think users have that mindset challenge. I think that I think that's more of maybe an IT shift that needs to happen. It's an interesting one. We don't have all the answers, but that's the biggest mindset shift that comes to mind. I think users are there, which is the idea of we need to leverage technology that's easy to use and that matches the pace of our work. And we should rely on great integration to just kind of make sure all the data is in the right place.
These questions are awesome. Keep them coming. So somebody asked, can you speak to how PLM or, the PLM ecosystem generally is able to move forward looking into NPD instead of simply acting as a data repository? I have one very specific thought on this, which actually, again, references some of the data that we didn't show you in this presentation today, but will be available in the full report, which is one thing we ask people is, if you had to go back and understand why a specific design decision was made, how long would it take somebody on your engineering team to go find that information? And most people said, I think over 60% of people said, it would take several hours to find out why one design decision was made. Only 13% of people said it would only take a few minutes. Some people said it would take days. And so where I think this shows up is people are often telling us that they never use lessons learned. And it's like one of the things that irks people to no end. Like, why do we keep making the same mistakes in new programs when this should have been a lesson learned from a past program? And I think part of what's driving that is the fact that this information is just not at people's fingertips, right? If every design decision or lesson learned takes hours to dig up and go find, then even if you have a dozen, 12 lessons learned that you want to leverage into future programs, it's going to take hours of admin work to actually prepare for the meeting to leverage those lessons learned and kick them off. So I think one way that the PLM ecosystem and tools like Colab can move forward and help teams be more forward-looking is by making it easier to access the design history of parts so that you can turn that into a repository of lessons learned and stop making the same mistakes twice.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, MJ.
Taylor, anything else to add on that point?
No, I think that I think that's a great point. I think there's lots of ways we can think about how to leverage the data repository that exists, all the kind of rich data that's in PLM. How can we use that to be more forward-looking in terms of new product development?
All right. This is a great question. How are non-technical people engaged to ensure they use the tool? I think, again, this is a specific question about Colab, but the observation behind this is it seems that management and customers aren't engaged in design reviews. It seems based on our research. So that's probably that chart where we're showing who's giving useful feedback throughout the process, let alone having these people be engaged in a specific design review tool. So how do we get non-technical people engaged, and specifically, how does Colab kind of address some of the data trends you see on this slide?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to this problem that we're looking at. So let's look at the most staggering, which is the fact that only 6% of teams are getting feedback from most of their customers. I think there's two parts. I think one part is sure it's difficult. It's difficult to do it with the tools at most teams' disposal. It's tricky to get on the calendars of your customer, deal with time zones, whatever, and have those conversations, especially when you have to ask for hours and hours of time often to do these reviews, because it's one person spinning a model or something and someone taking down notes. So I think that's one part, is that it's hard, and that maybe is why the other reason exists, which is that folks aren't asking. I think this is maybe where the mindset shift comes in, that we need to get proactive early and often feedback and not wait until the end. I think maybe the reason that people are fighting that idea or haven't made that mindset shift is that it's because it's difficult to do. In terms of how do we get non-technical people in here, I think the first point is that a lot of these folks, like customers and suppliers, would likely be technical. Not in all cases, though. Even if we just talk about, are they CAD users? Some are going to be CAD users. A lot are not going to be CAD users. One way that we have tackled that with Colab is to make the tool very easy to use and make sure that it looks nothing like a CAD tool. So Colab has a lot of feature parity with certain CAD tools as it relates to like interrogating a model. So it's sectioning and measuring and, explode and all that sort of stuff. But the tools to actually do that, all the tools that surround that kind of 3D viewer and all those tools just don't look like CAD. And that's on purpose. It looks like like a modern cloud SaaS application, not like a kind of many-year-old on-prem engineering tool.
I'll also add that depending on the group that you're trying to engage, I think for some groups it can be a push, and for some groups it can be a pull. So what we consistently see is the manufacturing team, who tends to be considered non-technical for a lot of companies, or perhaps they are technical, but not in our traditional sense of the term technical. So they're a non-technical stakeholder group, but they are consistently one of the groups that really wants to be engaged. And they're consistently one of those groups, to Taylor's point earlier, where when the feedback slips through the cracks, they're one of these people who are sitting there I swear that I said this to someone at some point. And so that's one of the groups where I think it's a pull, right? So once you eliminate some of these sources of friction, like the fact that manufacturing teams often just do not have access to the 3D CAD, and so therefore maybe they're being asked for feedback, but not until later in the process when you've got a 2D drawing available, or maybe they're not being asked for feedback at all. If you start removing that friction, make it really easy for them to access CAD inside a meeting or outside a meeting, and you make it really easy for them to just visually start providing their feedback, whether that's popping open a software during a pilot build or during a design review meeting and just having them involved. They get excited about it. And it starts to become a pull from them rather than a push from the engineering team. And we consistently see that with that group. I think there's other groups where it might have to be more of a push. Customers are probably an example of that. So one place that we see Colab being used is in RFQ processes. And it's a natural place for the company to do more of a push, right? Because if you're in a competitive RFQ process, the technical review might be a real opportunity for your engineering team to stand out against the competitors that might also be in that RFQ process. Because using a tool like this, you can really visually interrogate and show the full depth of your technical expertise that you bring to the table and kind of give yourself a competitive advantage. And so in that specific situation, there's a natural push that happens where you can get the customer engagement, but there's also kind of an incentive for your company to do so and make that push. So we see for different use cases, there are different best practices, and Colab will partner our customers up with a success person on Taylor's team who can basically roll out the best strategy, push, pull based on an organization's goal.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Is Colab a cloud-based solution?
Yes, it is.
Somebody else says very good information. Thank you. We appreciate you. How are the models imported into the software?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways. The primary way that most of our customers would get their models or drawings or whatever into Colab is via PLM integration. So whether that's Windchill or Teamcenter, we would integrate directly with the PLM, and then it's just a couple clicks to push whatever data you need to into Colab. Then there also is the option of a manual upload. So for folks that let's say you're trying to get data from a supplier and that supplier doesn't have Colab integrated into their PLM, they can just drag and drop files into Colab and they'll upload in depends how big the file is, but usually seconds.
Awesome. Do you have any information on how much improvement you get using Colab? How do you quantify the effectiveness of a design review?
Yeah. So a couple of we see depending on the use case, those kind of success factors might be different. Some common ones that we see and some benchmarks that we use would be a 30% reduction in product development time. So not design review time, but overall product development time. That number comes from a case study with Ford Pro. So with their use of Colab. Some other ones, though, would be a 50% reduction in design review time. But we also do a lot of BABE, for example. There, the goal is to increase the pipeline of cost reduction ideas that we're able to come up with so that you can deliver on those kind of VABE or cost reduction targets. And then how do you quantify the effectiveness of the design review? This is an interesting one. Some factors that come to mind in terms of effectiveness. are going to be, so some of the kind of lag measures might be engineering change. So how many of those issues reach production that need to go back and get fixed, late stage design errors, that sort of thing. Some of the leading indicators might be the number of feedback that comes up per sheet, might be something we use, like per drawing, might be per milestone. Like we can come up with sort of benchmarks for what is a good amount of feedback to come up. The number of reviews, one thing that we look at right in Collab is reviews closed on time, participation from people across reviews, how many people are participating. There's all kinds of different measures that we can use depending on the nature of the team that we're working with. But largely it is, the lead indicators are participation measures. So how many feedback is coming up and who's included and that sort of thing. And the lag indicator being like engineering change, late stage design errors, that sort of stuff.
I was on mute. Is the data exchange between Collab to PLM bidirectional? And I think this person is asking the question, particularly with the case of like late updates or additional updates that happen later in the process. They want to keep the review data up to date.
Yes. So yes, some of the data is bidirectional. Some of the data is not. So one of the main kind of bidirectional component in terms of Collab to PLM is this idea that the file exists in Collab. So it's been shared. A review is underway at a certain stage, whether that's open, in progress, revisions required, closed, whatever it might be, and the amount of unresolved feedback that's open. The other thing we do in Collab is we flag out of date revisions. So if you're looking in Collab at a design and a later kind of revision exists, we will flag that for you so that and you can push that again from PLM.
Awesome. Are there ways to create reoccurring reminders for all folks who are responsible for an open issue in Collab?
Yeah, so there is a notification system built into Collab. So you can get notifications via email in the app. There's kind of a number of different ways. They're very configurable in terms of what you want to be reminded of. And then there's also dashboards in Collab to be able to see reviews that are assigned to you that are out of date, reviews that are assigned to folks on your team that are past their due date or have high priority feedback that's past its completion date, that sort of thing. So there's all kinds of visibility on things that need to be complete because, with the current process, those things often just sit in your email inbox and it's someone else's job to chase you and make sure things get done. The notification system kind of makes it easy to build in that accountability.
Awesome. Well, first of all, Taylor, I'm glad we left plenty of time for questions. I think we were not anticipating the huge volume of questions we got. So thanks to everyone for all of your engagement. Maybe I'll wrap up with one last question for you, Taylor. You've presented this data a couple times now. The first time it was in person. And so you've had the opportunity to have like several kind of in-depth conversations with engineering leaders sparked by this data. So I'm curious, what are some of the most interesting pieces of feedback or questions you've gotten from engineering leaders since you've started sharing this data with the public?
I think one thing that was really interesting was the amount of interest we got in this data from folks outside of engineering, particularly from folks in manufacturing, that I think felt validated by this data is maybe the best way to put it, that had this feeling like we are suffering the consequences of things that could have been prevented. I think that maybe was the feeling that this data kind of validated. That was really surprising. Maybe now that I say it, it shouldn't have been that surprising, but it was. We spend most of our time talking to design and engineering teams. So it was really interesting to get so much participation and interest from manufacturing folks. I think more senior folks were really surprised by the stat around only 6% of teams are getting feedback from customers. I think that was really surprising. And then I think folks were very disheartened by the stat around over 40% of feedback that comes up in design reviews is lost. I think that was like disappointing to hear, because so much effort goes into design reviews, so much time. And especially it happened at really odd hours, and you don't want to spend 2 hours in a meeting that started at 5 a.m. to find out that almost half of what was presented just disappeared.
Yeah, that is definitely the big takeaway for me as well. I was shocked that that number was so high.
Yeah.
All right. So we had one more question about whether the recording is going to be shared. It will be shared. So because you've registered for this event, you will get the link to the recording. You'll also get a link to submit a form that'll allow you to be on the wait list for the full report. So I shared some sneak previews of data that wasn't in these slides, but will be in the full report. There's much more to come there as well. So if you're interested in that, you can join the wait list. It's probably going to come out next week, maybe the week after. So it's coming out really soon. And other than that, we would super appreciate if you saw anything interesting today, that you share it with others in your company. And we are totally happy to take a follow-up call with anyone who wants to dig deeper into how this might be showing up in your business, or ask Taylor one-on-one questions. You can find us both on LinkedIn. I'm MJ Smith, Taylor Young, and she is Taylor at collabsoftware.com. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.